It's 11 p.m. You were supposed to be asleep an hour ago, but somewhere between putting your phone down and actually closing your eyes, you opened one news article, just one, about a plane crash. And now it's 1 a.m. and you've watched 6 documentary clips, read 3 Wikipedia pages, and followed a thread of related stories so far from the original article that you're not entirely sure how you got here. Or maybe it's the true crime documentary that was supposed to be background noise while you cooked dinner, except you stopped cooking 20 minutes ago, and you're standing in your kitchen holding a spatula that has long since stopped being useful, completely unable to look away from a story about events that are objectively disturbing and that you will definitely think about before you fall asleep tonight. Or maybe it's simpler than that. You're driving on the highway and there's an accident on the opposite side of the road, completely unrelated to your lane, no practical reason to slow down or look, and yet every car around you slows to a crawl, every driver turns their head, and you, despite knowing exactly what you're doing, find your own eyes drifting toward the wreckage before your rational mind has a chance to intervene. You know this feeling. Everybody knows this feeling. And almost everybody feels at least a small amount of guilt about it. A vague sense that being drawn to disasters, accidents, scandals, and catastrophes reveals something uncomfortable about who you are, that maybe there is something a little bit broken, a little bit morbid, a little bit darker than you'd like to admit in the part of you that cannot look away. Here is what I want to tell you right now before we go any further. That guilt is misplaced, not because the fascination is harmless. We'll get to the ways it can be exploited and the costs it can carry, but because the fascination itself is not a character flaw, it is not evidence of a troubled psyche or a secret appetite for suffering. It is one of the most ancient, most adaptive, most fundamentally human features of your cognitive architecture, a survival system so deeply wired and so sophisticated that every major media platform, every news organization, every entertainment network on the planet has built their entire business model around exploiting it. Understanding why your brain does this changes everything. It changes how you feel about yourself. It changes how you see the media landscape around you. And it gives you something genuinely powerful, the ability to choose, with real awareness, when to follow this impulse and when to redirect it. By the end of this video, you will understand the 4 biological drives that make disaster fascinating to every human brain on the planet, why this system was one of our greatest evolutionary assets for hundreds of thousands of years, how it became one of our most exploited vulnerabilities in the attention economy, and what you can do with this knowledge that actually changes your relationship to the endless stream of catastrophe that modern media delivers to your nervous system 24 hours a day. This is the disaster attention system. Let's take it apart. You are not morbid, you are running ancient software. To understand disaster fascination, you have to start approximately 200,000 years ago, because that is where the system that produces it was built and optimized. For the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, the most important information your brain could possibly encounter was information about threats, predators, environmental dangers, social conflicts with the potential for violence, disease outbreaks within the group, food scarcity, hostile neighboring tribes. The individuals in your ancestral community who survived long enough to pass on their genes were overwhelmingly the ones whose brains were most aggressively attuned to threat information, who noticed the rustle in the grass before the ones who didn't, who paid attention to the story of how someone else's child was taken by a predator, who could not stop thinking about the danger they had narrowly avoided yesterday. Your brain today is the direct descendant of those brains. It carries the same fundamental threat surveillance architecture, a system that prioritizes negative, dangerous, and potentially catastrophic information over positive, safe, and ordinary information by a ratio that researchers estimate at somewhere between 3:1 and 5:1. This is called negativity bias, and it is one of the most robustly documented findings in all of psychology. Negativity bias means that your brain allocates more attention, more processing resources, more memory consolidation, and more emotional weight to negative information than to positive information of objectively equivalent significance. A threat-related stimulus captures your attention faster, holds it longer, is encoded more deeply in memory, and is retrieved more easily than a neutral or positive stimulus of the same intensity. This is not a bug. In the ancestral environment, it was the most important feature your brain had. The cost of missing a threat was death. The cost of missing a reward was hunger. The asymmetry of consequences shaped an asymmetry of attention that is still running in your brain right now, every time you scroll past a good news story to click on a disaster headline. But negativity bias alone does not fully explain disaster fascination. It explains why bad news gets your attention. It does not fully explain why you find it compelling, why you want to keep watching, keep reading, keep following the story. For that, we need to understand 3 additional biological drives that work alongside negativity bias to create the full disaster attention experience. The disaster attention system. 4 biological drives. Drive 1, threat surveillance, your brain's security guard that never sleeps. The first and most fundamental drive is what researchers call threat surveillance, your brain's continuous, automatic monitoring of the environment for signals of potential danger. This system, centered in the amygdala and operating largely below conscious awareness, does not work like a passive sensor that simply detects threats when they appear. It works like an active, agenda-driven security system that is constantly scanning, constantly categorizing, and constantly updating its threat model of the environment. Here is the critical feature of threat surveillance that explains disaster fascination specifically. Your threat surveillance system learns from other people's experiences just as readily as from your own. In fact, from an evolutionary perspective, learning about threats from other people's experiences was dramatically more efficient and less risky than learning from direct personal exposure. If a predator killed someone in your tribe, the optimal learning strategy was not to go find the predator yourself and see what happens. It was to pay the most intense possible attention to every detail of how that person was killed, what conditions created the vulnerability, what warning signs were missed, and what might have prevented the outcome. This is precisely why you cannot stop watching the plane crash documentary. Your threat surveillance system is not processing it as entertainment. It is processing it as a threat briefing. What went wrong? What were the warning signs? What could the passengers have done differently? What should I watch for? Your brain is treating the documentary as a fire drill, a low-cost simulation of a high-cost threat scenario that updates your threat model without requiring you to actually experience the threat. The fact that you fly rarely or never is irrelevant to this system. The threat surveillance mechanism does not perform relevance filtering. It just processes threat information with maximum intensity and retention. The same mechanism drives true crime fascination with particular intensity. True crime content is essentially a detailed, narrative-structured threat briefing about the most serious threat in human social life: violence from other humans. Who are the dangerous ones? What do they look like? How do they behave? How do they select their victims? What made those victims vulnerable? What warning signs were missed? Your threat surveillance system absorbs every detail of every true crime story with the urgent attentiveness of someone who genuinely believes this information could save their life. Because from the system's perspective, it could. It does not know you live in a low-crime suburb. It is running 200,000-year-old software. Drive 2, social learning from catastrophe, other people's disasters as survival education. The second drive operates in close partnership with threat surveillance but serves a slightly different function. Where threat surveillance is primarily about identifying dangers, social learning from catastrophe is about extracting lessons from disasters that update your behavioral strategies. Learning what not to do, who not to trust, which systems fail, which risks are more serious than they appear. Humans are the most socially dependent species on Earth. Our survival has always depended not just on individual intelligence, but on collective knowledge, the accumulated experience of the entire group, transmitted through stories, observations, and shared attention to significant events. Before writing, before formal education, before any systematic method of knowledge preservation, the primary mechanism for transmitting survival. Critical information across generations and across individuals was shared attention to significant events combined with narrative retelling of their meaning. Public disasters, whether they are plane crashes, building collapses, financial scandals, or natural catastrophes, are significant events in exactly the sense that this social learning system evolved to process. They represent moments when the normal operating assumptions of the world turned out to be wrong. The plane was supposed to be safe, the financial system was supposed to be stable, the levees were supposed to hold. When these assumptions fail catastrophically, the social learning system treats the failure as extremely high-value educational content, information about hidden risks, systemic vulnerabilities, and the gap between our models of the world and reality. This is why disaster coverage almost always follows a predictable narrative structure that your brain finds deeply satisfying. The setup, the failure, the investigation, the explanation, the lessons learned. Your social learning system is not just interested in what happened, it is intensely interested in why it happened and what it means for the future. The investigation phase of any disaster story, the forensic reconstruction of exactly how and why the catastrophic failure occurred, is the most cognitively and emotionally engaging part for most audiences, not the disaster itself, because that is the part that updates the threat model. That is the part the social learning system has been waiting for. Public scandals engage this same drive in the social domain specifically. Who betrayed whom and why? Who had power and how did they abuse it? Who seemed trustworthy and turned out not to be? These questions are as evolutionarily relevant as questions about physical threats, perhaps more so for a deeply social species whose survival and reproductive success depended heavily on navigating social alliances and identifying trustworthy versus untrustworthy members of the group. The political scandal, the corporate fraud, the celebrity downfall. Your brain processes all of these as social threat intelligence. Who has power? How do they use it? Who can be trusted? What are the warning signs of betrayal? Drive 3. Safe threat simulation. The neurological thrill of danger without consequences. The third drive is the one most responsible for the pleasure component of disaster fascination, the experience that goes beyond mere attention and into something that is genuinely enjoyable in a way that most people feel slightly guilty about. Your brain has a dedicated system for simulating threatening experiences in safe conditions. This system, sometimes called the parasocial safety mechanism, allows your threat response circuitry to activate, your stress hormones to elevate, and your survival attention to sharpen, while simultaneously maintaining the awareness that you are not in actual danger. The result is a neurological state that combines the alertness and intensity of a genuine threat response with the safety of a situation where no actual harm can reach you. This state is not just neutral, it is actively pleasurable. The activation of your threat response system in safe conditions produces a complex neurochemical cocktail. Elevated norepinephrine sharpening your attention, cortisol heightening your arousal, dopamine rewarding the engagement with potentially significant information that creates a heightened, alert, intensely engaged experiential state that your brain's reward system tags as worth seeking out and repeating. This is the neurological mechanism behind horror films, roller coasters, extreme sports spectatorship, and true crime. All of these experiences activate the threat response system in conditions where the rational mind simultaneously maintains the knowledge of safety, and that combination produces a uniquely compelling experiential state that is essentially unavailable through any other means. You cannot get this feeling from watching a documentary about flowers. The threat component is required. The safety component is what makes it pleasurable rather than just frightening. Research by psychologist Coltan Scrivener at the University of Chicago has specifically investigated morbid curiosity, the fascination with death, danger, and disaster, and found that it serves a genuine adaptive function. People with higher levels of morbid curiosity score better on measures of threat preparedness, are more effective at generating strategies for dangerous scenarios, and report lower levels of anxiety in genuinely dangerous situations. The safe threat simulation is not just entertainment, it is practice. Your brain is training its threat response in conditions where the training is free of actual risk. Drive 4. Negativity bias amplification. the media machine that never turns off. The fourth drive is different from the first three in an important way. It is not purely a biological drive, and it is the intersection of your biological drives with an artificial environment specifically engineered to exploit them. The media and attention economy did not invent disaster fascination. They discovered it, discovered that human attention is disproportionately and reliably captured by negative, threatening, and catastrophic content, and then built entire industries around delivering a continuous, optimized supply of exactly that content to the most exploitable neurological access point available: your phone, your news feed, your recommendation algorithm. Here is the mechanism. Your negativity bias, your threat surveillance system, and your safe threat simulation drive are all calibrated to the baseline frequency and intensity of threatening events in a natural, pre-digital human environment. In that environment, genuine catastrophes were relatively rare. A predator attack, a flood, a violent conflict, these were significant events precisely because they were exceptional. Your threat surveillance system evolved to activate intensely in response to rare, genuine threats, and to return to baseline relatively quickly once the threat had passed. The modern media environment systematically destroys this calibration by delivering an uninterrupted stream of disaster content, curated for maximum emotional impact, stripped of the geographic and statistical context that would reveal how rare most of these events are relative to your actual life, and algorithmically optimized for engagement by testing which framings and images produce the strongest threat response. It keeps your threat surveillance system in a state of continuous activation that it was never designed to sustain. The result is something researchers call mean world syndrome, a term coined by communications scholar George Gerbner to describe the systematic distortion of threat perception that heavy media consumption produces. People who consume large quantities of news and disaster content consistently overestimate the probability of violent crime, plane crashes, terrorist attacks, and other low-frequency but highly covered events in their actual environment. Their threat model of the world is not calibrated to reality. It is calibrated to the editorial and algorithmic choices of media organizations whose business model depends on keeping their threat surveillance systems engaged. This matters because a perpetually activated threat surveillance system is not just an attention management problem, it is a physiological health problem. Chronic activation of the stress response, sustained elevated cortisol, sustained sympathetic nervous system dominance, produces measurable negative effects on cardiovascular health, immune function, sleep quality, cognitive performance, and mental health. The media's exploitation of your disaster attention system is not just shaping what you think about, it is shaping your physical and psychological well-being in ways that serve their interests and harm yours. If this is making you think about your own media consumption habits right now, hit that like button and tell me in the comments. What disaster content do you find hardest to look away from? True crime? News? Scandals? I want to know why we have always loved disaster, the historical record. One of the most important things to understand about disaster fascination is that it is not a product of the modern media age. The platforms that exploit it are modern. The drive itself is ancient beyond reckoning. The Roman Colosseum held 50,000 spectators who gathered regularly to watch gladiatorial combat and public executions. Events that blended threat surveillance, social learning, and safe threat simulation in the most direct possible form. Public executions remained major public events throughout medieval and early modern Europe, drawing crowds that treated them as entertainment and social occasions. The practice of gathering publicly to observe death and disaster was not considered aberrant behavior. It was a normal and regular feature of social life across virtually every human culture with the population density to support a crowd. The first newspapers, published in the early 17th century, quickly discovered what their modern descendants have never forgotten. Crime, disaster, and scandal sold papers, not because early readers were uniquely morbid or morally inferior to us, because they were human, because the same biological drives that keep you watching true crime documentaries at midnight were keeping your ancestors gathered around the town crier and crowded into public squares for executions 300 years ago. The true crime genre, currently one of the most commercially successful genres in both podcast and streaming content, is simply the most sophisticated modern iteration of a story format that has existed for as long as humans have been telling stories. The cautionary tale, the account of what went wrong and why and what the consequences were. In every culture across human history, stories about death, danger, betrayal, and catastrophe have formed the core of oral and written narrative traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written stories in existence, is fundamentally a story about death and the terrifying vulnerability of even the most powerful person to loss. Disaster has always been at the center of human storytelling because it has always been at the center of human attention. What changes across history is not the drive itself, but the supply chain that delivers its content. The ancient world's disaster content was limited by the frequency of actual local events and the speed of news transmission. The modern world has eliminated both limits simultaneously. Events from anywhere on the planet reach your attention within minutes, and algorithmic curation ensures that the most engaging, meaning the most emotionally activating, content rises to the top of your feed regardless of its geographic distance from your actual life or its statistical relevance to your actual risk profile. Reclaiming your attention. What awareness actually changes? Understanding the disaster attention system does not make you immune to it. Your amygdala does not update its operating parameters based on intellectual knowledge. Your negativity bias does not turn off because you understand its evolutionary origins. These drives are structural. They will continue operating in your brain for the rest of your life. What understanding changes is the layer above the drives, your conscious relationship to them. And that change is more significant than it might initially sound. Before understanding these mechanisms, when you found yourself unable to stop scrolling through disaster content, you experienced the pull as simply what you wanted. Your attention went to the content and you followed it, and the following felt like preference. After understanding these mechanisms, you have a new option. You can notice the pull, name its source accurately. This is my threat surveillance system being activated by content engineered to activate it, and make a genuine choice about whether to follow it or redirect it. Not every time, not perfectly, but often enough to matter. The specific practice that research supports most strongly for managing media-driven negativity bias amplification is what media psychologists call intentional consumption. The replacement of passive, algorithmically driven content exposure with active, self-directed choices about what disaster content you engage with and why. This means choosing your true crime deliberately rather than letting the recommendation algorithm choose it for you. It means checking news at specific times you decide in advance rather than in response to push notifications your phone generates to maximize engagement. It means asking, before following a disaster story deeper, whether you are engaging with it because it provides genuinely useful threat intelligence or because the algorithm has successfully triggered your threat surveillance system. The distinction matters because your threat surveillance system cannot make this judgment for itself. It treats all disaster content as equally relevant regardless of how remote the event is from your actual life, how unlikely the threat is to affect you, or how much of the coverage is emotional amplification designed to keep you engaged rather than genuine information designed to make you safer. Only your prefrontal cortex can make the judgment about whether a specific piece of disaster content is serving your actual interests, and it can only make that judgment if you give it the moment of deliberate pause required to engage. You are not powerless against your own ancient software. You are simply working with hardware that requires conscious override rather than automatic update. Your disaster attention system recap. Drive 1. Threat surveillance. Your brain processes disaster content as a threat briefing. It is running a continuous safety update on your model of the world's dangers. True crime is a social threat briefing. Plane crash documentaries are environmental threat briefings. Your brain cannot stop watching because it is convinced the information might save your life. Drive 2. Social learning from catastrophe. Disasters are high-value lessons about hidden risks, system failures, and the gap between assumptions and reality. Your social learning system is extracting everything it can about what went wrong and why before the story moves on. Drive 3. Safe threat simulation. Engaging with disaster content in conditions of personal safety produces a neurochemical state, alert, engaged, heightened, that your brain's reward system treats as genuinely pleasurable. This is the neurological foundation of horror, true crime, and spectator disaster fascination. Drive 4. Negativity bias amplification. Your 3 biological drives have been discovered, mapped, and systematically exploited by media organizations and algorithmic platforms that deliver an engineered supply of disaster content calibrated to maximum threat response activation. Your brain was not built for this volume and intensity of disaster stimulation. The chronic activation it produces has real physiological and psychological costs. You are not morbid, you are not broken, you are not secretly hoping for bad things to happen to other people. You are a human being running an ancient cognitive operating system that spent 200,000 years being shaped by an environment where paying maximum attention to disasters and catastrophes was one of the most adaptive things a brain could possibly do. That system has not been updated. The environment has changed beyond recognition, and the gap between the system you are running and the environment you are running it in is being exploited deliberately, systematically, and profitably by every platform competing for your attention in the modern world. Knowing this does not make you immune, but it makes you something more valuable than immune. It makes you aware. And awareness, genuine, clear-eyed, scientifically grounded awareness of your own cognitive architecture, is the only tool that has ever reliably restored human agency in the face of systems designed to eliminate it. You now have the map. The terrain has not changed, but at least now you can see it for what it is. Like this video, if this just explained something you have felt your entire life but never quite understood, subscribe, because next week we are going into the psychology of self-deception. The specific ways your brain constructs a version of reality that protects your ego rather than reflects the truth, and why the smartest people are sometimes the most completely deceived. That one is going to be deeply personal for almost everyone who watches it. Let's go.